Good. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. We're very touched that those in the room have chosen to be here rather than across the river with Lady Gaga and Roots and Oprah and of course Kamala Harris and tens of thousands of others, presumably. But you're here, and that's what matters to us. Welcome also everybody who's zooming in to this evening's session of the workshop in the history of material texts, and to the opportunity, in spite of what I've just said, to spend an hour or two thinking about something other than what we'll all be thinking about with greater relief tomorrow. I'm Jerry Singerman, formerly humanities editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollack, Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. We all three are made to look efficient by Peter Diamond, who's graduate student in the Penn English Department and the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. For those of you who are in the room with us, please sign the attendance sheet that I see circulating around. And if you're not already on the listserv and would like to be, please add your email address. For those of you who are joining us remotely, please also join the mailing list if you're not already on it by sending your coordinates to Peter using the chat function. Please mute yourselves, of course, during the talk, but make yourselves known while silent by using the chat function, which Peter will be curating. During the Q&A, please use the raise hand function so that we may call upon you directly. Now, it's an overdue pleasure to welcome Lisa Gitelman back to the workshop. Lisa took her undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago, her master's and PhD in English at Columbia. She's professor in the departments of English and Media, Culture, and Communication, and a founding member of the Digital Media Lab, all at NYU, where her online profile describes her research concerns far better than I could without cribbing from it. So it is American Book History, Techniques of Inscription, and the New Media of Yesterday and Today. Yesterday, extending deep into the mid-18th century in New Media, 1740 to 1915, a volume she co-edited with Jeffrey B. Pingree, but more often referring to the late 19th century, as in her Stanford monograph, Scripts, Grooves, and Writing Machines, Representing Technology in the Edison Era, a book that explores the inscriptive practices as played out in the shorthand alphabets, phonograph records, typewritten documents, and early films that were all artifacts of that period. Cribbing further from her NYU profile, I read that Lisa Gitelman, quote, is particularly concerned with tracing the patterns according to which new media become meaningful within and against the context of older media, a subject she explores in her paper Knowledge Toward a History of Documents, which was published by Duke. The documents there in question range from the productions of 19th century job printers to mimeographs and microfilms in the 1930s, xerography in the 1970s, and the PDFs of the last decade. Still to come when she published that book was the translation of Moby Dick into emojis, the topic of her last presentation to this group, which many of us remember. A review in the TLS praised Paper Knowledge as, quote, an essay in media archaeology that takes as its central category the document as a material genre. The words matter, but so too does their physical instantiation, demonstrating, if there was any doubt whatsoever, that Lisa Gitelman and we share a scholarly worldview. In the American Historical Review, Jonathan Coopersmith lauded that book for, quote, expanding our conceptualization and confusion of the history of physical and electronic documents. In this case, confusing, as in unsettling and complicating, I take as a very good and valuable thing. So I trust you will. So Lisa Gitelman's work has been supported by fellowships from the American Antiquarian Society, the Rutgers University Center for Cultural Analysis, the Leslie Center Humanities Institute at Dartmouth, the University of Iowa Obermann Center for Advanced Study, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In addition to the works already mentioned, she served as editor of the papers of Thomas Edison, which makes total sense once you think about it. Was editor of the volume Raw Data is an Oxymoron, and author also of Always Already Knew, Media History and the Data of Culture, both also published by MIT. But enough of my introduction. I ask you all to please join me in welcoming back Lisa Gitelman, who is, I assure you, actually in the room with an apparently legible text before her, even if her topic tonight is typographical hallucinations. So.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for that way too kind introduction, which I could spend a long time responding to, as well to Zachary, John, for the invitation, and Peter for all the logistics and help. I hope I have brought something that will interest you. It is completely new, so I'm a little more wedded to the paper than I might like, but I'll try not to read at you. This is maybe, I wrote this last month. This is the second iteration, and I'd love your help in just sort of thinking it forward. If you can. It's about 35 minutes long, last time I checked, unless I wander into too many digressions. And if I'm not loud enough, I think that Peter will tell me to move away, closer to the mic. I want to talk about typographical hallucinations. The people who have created our current generative AI systems admit that these systems used to generate images struggle with text. The system I'm going to talk about most centrally is OpenAI's DALL-E 3, which is one of the current image generating systems. They hallucinate typographical form, but they're really good at context for typography. I wanted to ask, what can their mistakes tell us about AI? And is there anything that these mistakes can tell us about typography? Is there something that DALL-E 3 knows about typography, in short, that we don't? Material text. Today, I want to activate those questions really in relation to questions about the 19th century printing trades, and in particular, the specimen books published by type founders. If I can use the jargon of today's computational neural networks, we could say that type specimen books stitch together sequences of tokens based upon all of the sequences previously observed amid oceans of training data, anything that printers had read or set. So today's AI operates on data at internet scale, and I'm invoking the universe of printed matter as a 19th century analog, analog. I should say that I want this pairing of yesterday and today to be suggestive, not ridiculous. I think for me, there were sort of two places to go to think about the connection. Past and present. First, if I think about 19th century specimen books, they've always felt generated to me in a certain sense, intricately assembled, mechanically reproduced, of course, but then also lavishly out of keeping with human authorship, as it has been lately, celebrated, right? Authorship, capital A, is both a legal framework, copyright, a liberal ideology, a way of thinking about creativity primarily in relation to an individual human subject, right? The genius. Specimen books published by type foundries are authorless. Their genesis lies not with genius, but elsewhere, within a vast text and image generating complex that I'm calling the printing trades, just for the sake of convenience. Now, just if you haven't looked at 19th century specimen books, and I can imagine there are so many specialties in the room, maybe some of you haven't, that's not right. I wanted to, this should go, there we go. I have just a quick kind of random pull from this is from an 1870s specimen book to show you what I'm going to be talking about. So one of these connections I'm intuiting is really about authorlessness. The other connection I'll make is that some of the pleasures that I and others have experienced reading type specimen books feel very much of a piece to me to the pleasures that I've experienced messing around with DALL-E 3. And I'll try and get back to that point in a sec. But first, a few general words of orientation before I show you some of these, a few typographical hallucinations. So amid the bubble of excitement around generative AI, you will have, I think, also heard an undertone of concern. And I want to just acknowledge those concerns at the get-go. Critics rightly point to the enormous and increasing amounts of fossil fuels being expended to train these models. Others point to the inbuilt hazards of racism, misogyny, and hate speech, demanding guardrails by industry and all kinds of regulatory schemes for implementation. We all worry about cheating by students or frauds and flubs by professionals who let AI do their work for them. We might also worry about the intellectual property subsumed without permission into training data sets. As well as about what's going to happen after too much of the data used to train the systems will have been generated by them, what Matt Kirschenbaum has called the textpocalypse. We have to worry about the rise in increasingly better deepfakes by propagandists and trolls. And all of this is to say nothing of warnings by a small group of AI experts about vast societal risks lying ahead, basically robot overlords, comparable, they say, to the risks posed by nuclear weapons and global pandemics. I want to acknowledge all of those concerns, and I am deeply cynical. I'm from New York, but I agree with colleagues that we should be excited to learn about and from these systems. I mean, I think humanists in particular have a lot to say in enjoying this conversation. At least I think that we can all agree that interpreting and thinking about these systems should not be left to their architects and investors. Machine learning is an inherently social and political project, Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen remind us, not a purely technical one. Even details that do seem purely technical turn out to be shot through with assumptions that we might want to learn to unpack. Just for instance, I earlier alluded to tokens, and I'm going to try and do this for data science jargon and not do it at other times. It's a terrible habit. Jargon. I earlier alluded to tokens. In semiotics, as in a sense in printing, a token is a single instance of a type, a representative. Data scientists use this term too, but you have to turn your head slightly sideways to understand how. Huge data, I mean, unfathomably large data sets are tokenized in the jargon of data science. And this is the process whereby they are pre-processed or cooked in order to become actionable. So strings of text get cut into small chunks, tokens, and cleaned up in order to become operable representations of the material in question. And image data is tokenized too. So here's a visualization of how OpenAI tokenizes text. It's a technical process, but it is not a neutral one, since at every step, tokenization harbors assumptions about textuality, about what textuality is and how it works. This is kind of Tyler's point in this article that I've grabbed his visualization from. Okay. Another thing to say about AI is just that it's really recent, right? Artificial intelligence research has been decades long, but what we're experiencing now really is new. It was only in 2019 when OpenAI announced its breakthrough with GPT-2, and that's a transformer-based large language model trained on 8 million web pages. They trained it. It tuned itself to fit the data to do next word, actually next token prediction. So given a string of text, what comes next? What token comes next? It was a breakthrough because it turned out that training GPT-2 to do next token prediction actually enabled it to do all kinds of things. It could answer questions, it could do translations, it could do summarizations, it could summarize in the voice of your favorite author. The researchers sounded just gobsmacked. They were, giddy as they publicized their results. I mean, you didn't have to teach GPT-2 to do things. Once it could predict next tokens, it would know how to do them already. So by implication, knowledge inheres in language in some really unexpected ways. A giant question mark, of course. To showcase their most astonishing results, OpenAI had GPT-2 generate realistic and coherent continuations of a prompt that they gave it. Remember, this is 2019. Asked to write about a herd of unicorns living in a remote, previously unexplored valley in the Andes, for instance, GPT-2 dilated at length, noting that these four-horned unicorns were previously unknown to science. Now, tickled as they were by the fabulousness of their system, this four-horned unicorn went completely unremarked by these authors and by everybody else who wrote about their paper. OpenAI did admit at the time world modeling failures. It's hard to count this as that. And of course, hallucination is the term now given to incorrect or misleading results by these generative AIs. And I can give you just a couple of more banal kind of classic examples. In 2023, I gave my students an assignment to write about a relatively obscure novel, obscure in the sense that it's not well represented online, either itself or criticism about it. And so one student handed in an essay that included characters and direct quotations that ChatGPT had made up, fabricated. Another student handed in an essay with a perfectly formatted citation, right, including a live link to JSTOR, naming an article by an actual scholar that simply doesn't exist, right? Click the link, live link, and you go to a different article in JSTOR. It was a complete fabrication. So those are hallucinations. Data science really remains prone to surprise, and breakthroughs in image generation have been more recent still. These systems to produce errant results, and I'll show you the first typographical hallucination that I can remember encountering. This was during the protests on campus last spring. My students and I spent a few happy moments asking a generative AI system called GenCraft to create images of a typical NYU protester over and over and over again. And we kept getting male students of color with facial hair, suggesting something about the data on which GenCraft had been trained. And you should know that once these systems are trained, they're kind of frozen. Right. So what we were seeing was effectively incredibly elaborate data visualizations, but the data being visualized was out of date. Right. So nothing Gaza related, just kind of Black Lives Matter all the way down was our supposition. And GenCraft got the school color completely right, but not the letters. And this kind of had me hooked. Generative systems like these get trained on images that have been labeled by humans, so image plus text. And OpenAI, when they made DALL-E 3, made one crucial improvement. They use AI to augment the human affixed labels. And the caption bot that they employ to create this sort of synthetic captioning is able to discern text in images. So AI describes an image, including the words it contains, and then the whole bundle, image and text, is used to train DALL-E 3. And so when we ask DALL-E 3 to generate an image, we type in, text. It analyzes the text as text, but then it analyzes the text in relation to text-image correlation in the training data. So there are multiple architectures involved. In October 2023, so this is exactly a year ago, more or less, OpenAI vaunted their results, showing off what DALL-E 3 can come up with. And once again, they were so chuffed. And they had published an article and had lots of examples. I'll pull out the typographic one. They asked DALL-E 3 to generate a 1960s style poster. And we're clearly very pleased with the results. And you can notice immediately the unicorn. They admit the snafu. They hypothesized that glitches like this result from the way that DALL-E 3 is designed to operate on the prompts that you give it as word and subword tokens rather than as individual characters. But they don't know for sure. They really don't know for sure. So now let me just show you a few examples that I pulled out over the summer when I was thinking about this talk. I went to signage, first of all, and I think you can say some things about the aesthetic here. You can also probably start to make guesses about training data. This is the image that Peter circulated that I think, sorry, hilariously funny. I like the animation aesthetic here too in interesting ways. Then I went to books. Again, I think you could say some things about what's going on here without knowing for sure. This I did recently. I asked for a shelf of books, and there's the word shooks in the foreground. I don't understand why. I went to newspaper. I got better at this after a while over the summer. So after the upper left image, I specified in English. And you can see that, these systems this is all DALL-E 3. They're really, really, really good. They're just not perfect. And there's some howlers for sure. I spent a long time asking for a big book open to chapter 12, which it seemed to really stumble with over and over again, so much so that I finally asked it for a big book open to chapter Twelton. It didn't really like that idea, but it did it anyway, and it kind of couldn't go there. And the Harry Potter aesthetic drives me insane. Okay, last one of these, I got really interested in just letter forms after seeing so many of these. And in some respects, these are kind of my favorite because I asked for these, children's alphabet book. And what it says is that you can't have an X without a xylophone and vice versa, right? And you can't have a Z without a zebra. You can't have a V without a violin. And then if you look at the bottom right image, you cannot have a U without a Q or a Q without a U. I just kind of love it. Now, even describing these hallucinations, though, presents a challenge. I mean, earlier I called them mistakes, but DALL-E 3 is working precisely according to its quite sophisticated architectures on data that it's been fed, right? Even if no one can tell us precisely what's happening deep within the model. Typographical hallucinations are not typographical errors. Warts and all, AI-generated images can be said to reveal hidden facets of the data used to produce them. And my colleague, Cliff Siskind, has proposed kind of further that this is kind of an emergent ability of generative AI. Think of it, he writes, as a kind of uncommon common sense. These aren't arbitrary errors. So could we try and approach typographical hallucination in this way? Maybe DALL-E 3 isn't faking typography as much as it is tagging some kind of possibility space where typographical form and typographical function can be read out from all the images on the internet, right? So all the images on the internet I think of as sort of typography in the wild. Could we maybe construe these hallucinations, use the coinage of another colleague, as algorithmic signs, right? So outliers operating in some margin between the allegorical and the algorithmic. It's almost impossible to say, algorithmic. If they are, right, algorithmic, they might be contrasted to the purely allegorical quality of the celestial letters discussed recently by Johanna Drucker in her recent book on the alphabet. And Drucker, if you've read it, is discussing this long-lived manuscript tradition that survived into printing as the so-called antediluvian alphabets. So think about the Theban alphabet published in the Polygraphia. If I understand it, actual types used to print made-up characters in an invented language, right? So an allegory of communication in 2 or 3 dimensions. Or what about the so-called real character devised by Bishop John Wilkins and cut by John Moxon in 1668? So these were actual types aimed at representing thought on paper without recourse to language. So like numerals or mathematical symbols, supposed to give everybody access to the same concepts, despite our post-Babel confusion of tongues. Now, in Moxon, I have finally mentioned an actual printer. So I want to change gears and see if I can't turn to type specimen books from the 19th century and see if we can't get them into conversation with the hallucinatory present I've been trying to evoke. I mean, gently, I really do not want to force this. So type specimens have to be as old as type. The earliest extant, I think, is from 1486. Specimen books were published, hundreds of them, in the 18th and 19th centuries to advertise the wares of type foundries to supply printers with type and other supplies. I have to say that my generalizations about the genre are based on US examples from the 1870s and 80s. When the printing trade, hugely diverse, operated in the context of industrialization. It's the period I know best, but it's also this period of intense sort of industrial framing. Sure, old iron hand presses, small town print shops were still abundant across the United States, but urban industrial outfits had turned letterpress into a mass media. Printing and publishing, the kind of imperfect designation of the US Census Bureau, had become the second largest industry in the United States oriented towards specialty production, right? So just massively capitalized. Meanwhile, industrial methods were having a profound, if uneven, effect on the three sectors of the printing trades, loosely newspaper, book, and job printing, as well as on suppliers like the type foundries. Stereotyping and electrotyping, for instance, had already made profound changes to the American book business. It's a great new book on this. They had these industrial techniques had wholly different implications for newspaper publishers and job printers after that. It's all covered in this book. In type founding, these industrial methods, so electrotyping, for instance, electrolytic exchange of metal ions, meant that for the first time, matrices used to cast type could be exactly copied. Exact duplication before this, right, had been something that happened by using the same matrix to produce unworn sorts of type, right? So the pieces of type would be identical if cast from the same matrix, but the Baskerville, face of one house might be different infinitesimally than the Baskerville of another foundry if they had cut their own punches, right? If they were using different matrices. Now, matrices themselves could be exact copies of each other, effectively making typographical design more coherent as such. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is the case made by type founder George Bruce when he sought the first US designed patent in the 1840s. So type specimen books showcase the enormous creativity of 19th century designers as decorative or what are called display fonts became endemic to the period's commercial messaging. The commercial messaging is the flip side of this industrialization. These specimen books testify to what has to be clocked as the kind of unaccountable scope of typography as a medium. And this is really the provocation behind Kate Bordeaux's recent book, which has really influenced my thinking here. Why, if we're meant to look through typefaces to the meanings the letters communicate, are there so many and more and more and more? I mean, to the tens and tens of thousands. The typographer's task has always been, Robert Bringhurst writes, to add a somewhat unnatural edge, an artificial order to the power of the writing hand, right? So if each typeface constitutes an artificial machine order, what's the supra order that embraces them all? So these type specimen books were addressed to potential customers in the printing trades, called variously things like the initiated or the typographical fraternity. And a large part of the appeal of these books today, I think, comes from this insider quality they display. We glimpse the raucous back room of modernity's great sense-making institution, Patricia Crane writes in her review of Alistair Johnson's invaluable Alphabets to Order. The back room, it turns out, was a descendant of the ritual world of the 18th century print shop, right? Calling to mind the Great Cat Massacre, if you like. A pre-industrial guild mentality kind of riots behind the spiffy of still aspirational efficiencies of modern industrial production. And guild-specific lore is everywhere in these specimen books, as well as a species of humor that can be really kind of difficult to put your finger on. I mean, it's arch, it's zany, and again, variously kind of in the know. But a few quick words about what I'm calling the lore in the books. Alistair Johnson describes the textual content of specimen books, noting the early use, for instance, of Cicero's oration against Catiline, which became totemic as printers and type founders reused each other's uses of the same Latin quotation to show off blocks of text. You could say that specimen books learn from each other. Reusing the same matter set in different typefaces performed one species of fraternal solidarity. Another species of fraternal solidarity was performed in matter that refers to printing or printing history. All a compensatory gesture, I can't help but think, in the absence of authorship, right? So fraternal solidarity without capital A authors. George Bruce's sons, right, same guy who got that first design patent, the same house, has an 1882 specimen book that is really most noteworthy in this regard. It's a kind of incredible pastiche of fragmented book history, and you can see the Cicero oration on the right there. The book actually concludes by reprinting the entire invention of printing by Theodore de Vinne, the 1878 mini monograph. Every page of de Vinne is presented in a different book face, or in the same book face, differently lettered. It's just a kind of tour de force. So the Gutenberg cult kind of emerges in snatches amid a groundswell of nonsense. Johnston makes the helpful point that the creators of specimen books formed an advance guard in the cause of abstraction, discarding language as blithely as European painters came to discard the object around, the Annus Mirabilis of 1912. The linguistic function of typography, to adopt Brideau's careful distinction, is set aside, right, held apart from typographical form. Typographical form without verbal meaning has a visual meaning of its own, right? It's variable, it's variably relational, it's shapely, we could say. It's apprehended by typesetters as letter fit and letter space, for instance, via Gestalt, and according to what Johanna Drucker has kind of mapped out as visual epistemology. And I'm going to return in a moment to this question of abstraction. It's not something that I can really limn all that effectively. It's a big sloppy category, but I will try and get back to it. First, I do think that Johnston goes one step too far. He reads type specimens as modernist or concrete poetry avant la lettre. It's a really appealing anachronism, but I feel it's really worth resisting. That the specimens are not poetry may be inferred from the fact that some of the specimens contain poetry. And as the work of Meredith McGill and others has allowed us to see, we shouldn't think of 19th century poems as if they were written or somehow destined for readers of a book, right? Type specimens in this period were book-born and book-bound, right? But poetry was largely consumed in more perishable formats. So if we can start to think about newspapers, this is Meredith, as a primary vehicle for the circulation of poetry, then we'll understand 19th century poetry not as a form of, kind of sappy, risible filler, but rather as what printers cherished as fact. Like display advertising, poetry had to be typeset with lots of quadrats and other furniture to leave blank spaces on the printed page. Indeed, as Meredith McGill writes, we might consider that the white space associated with poetry and with advertisements came to signify entertainment, an appeal to pleasure in 19th century newspapers. I mean, I think type specimen books show the printing trades reveling in precisely this kind of pleasure, right? Their fragments and juxtapositions are endlessly entertaining for us and must have been for their readers then, but they're not poetry, they're advertising, right? Jingles, if you must. Whatever else these are, they're trade catalogs, right? With the very unusual and defining feature that the wares they advertise were entirely essential to the production. Printed specimens advertise available fonts sold by the pound via selected representative sorts. We'd have to call these tokens, right? Right, so specimen books advertise types by means of tokens, and then they advertise type founding by means of composition, press work, and bookbinding, right, making catalogs. This is not to say that the printed specimens are sufficient to demonstrate everything that these catalogs boasted for sale. You know, among other things, one type specimen book that I've read promoted its accurate bodies, perfect faces, and durable metals. So tokens were necessary but not sufficient to the self-promotion of types that are represented here. And just, you know, to be clear in a different way, in order to function as specimens, they all required labels, right? Names, numbers, and size designations. Not to mention, you know, price lists and instructions for ordering and all kinds of other information. So this makes them like other trade catalogs, even though they're still very different. And if the specimens required labels, right, so out in the universe of printed matter, alphanumeric text has always required paratextual accoutrements, right? These specimen books demonstrate typefaces, sure, but they always also demonstrate borders, ornaments, and cuts of dizzying variety, as well as all kinds of other, you know, sort of printing material. And I have another, this is much shorter, but a kind of random flip. This is McKellar Smith's Origin of Jordan again, to show some of these, the variety of these ornaments. So these are all specimens, right? And they're all labeled. In some complicated cases, the specimen books also include illustrations, right? If they're selling a printing press, they would offer an illustration of it. They couldn't, you know, give a specimen printing press in the book. So there are complicated cases like this one, right? The image on the left is going to be an illustration, but the image on the right is actually a specimen. And this is a particularly interesting specimen on the right because, as it kind of explains, all the quadrats, all the furniture in this composition have been raised type high so you can see them. It makes a really good, this image makes a really good reminder for the uninitiated that behind the scenes, the entire area of a printed page is assembled from tokens, if I can slide towards the data scientific use of that term. Like AI generated images and texts, letterpress pages are assemblies. They're composites. They constitute a whole based purely on parts pieced together. And you know, so Google can find you a pre-existing digital image. DALL-E 3 generates a completely new one out of tokens from its training data. Right, so I hope this is just a gentle point of contact here. In her remarkable efforts to understand typography as a medium with its own mode of presentation, right, its own artificial order of orders, Kate Brideau wants to bracket linguistic function and face the operational logic in the full embodied in the full diversity of typographical forms, right? Again, to kind of clock in the massive diversity of face designs. It's an operational logic, she ventures, beyond human capability, which when I read it just sounded like an invitation for AI. So when I asked at the outset whether generative AI might not know something about typography that we don't, I was kind of barking up this tree. After all, these systems excel at abstraction. right? A human being would have a really hard time developing explicit criteria, like writing a program to identify whether an image contains an image of an image contains a horse or a unicorn or a porcupine or anything else. But having a machine learn the criteria based on a huge number of examples turns out to work extremely well. So they were kind of abstraction machines in a way. And I guess when I started writing this paper, oh so long ago, I was thinking that systems trained on image data might be able to see typographical shape as shape, right? Like without the linguistic baggage. So something like OCR, but stopping just short of the R. But then I did the rest of the work here, and holding typographical form apart from its linguistic function, if indeed possible, is not at all useful here. That unicorn detector that I just hypothesized, right, would have had to be trained on labeled image data. Training generative systems like DALL-E 3 clearly depends upon an intricate negotiation of text and image, in which the two modalities, sorry, of data get correlated within the same mathematical embedding space. If we are going to learn something relevant to typography from generative AI, I think it may be about this image-text nexus to which the typographical hallucinations direct our gaze. And this is kind of my main point, so let me put it a little bit differently. Typography and image generating systems like DALL-E 3, right, apples, oranges, seem to me to be the two most significant sites where visual form and linguistic function work as inextricable complements of each other, like two sides of the same page. And this is, an active area of research in data science. So stay tuned. I wandered a little bit far into the weeds here and mentioned embedding spaces. So I'm gonna backpedal and work towards a conclusion, not to keep you too long. I want to say one or two very obvious things about specimen books to end, and then turn finally to pleasure to try and make a connection between generative AI and print publication. So in the field of media studies, we have gotten very comfortable, very used to this idea of affordances. I think it's a soft determinism somehow. It's a useful term. I think it was adopted originally from the design thinking of Donald Norman. But we say things like different media, different technologies have different affordances, right? Different capabilities, real and perceived, that make a difference, all kinds of difference to communication. But thinking again about the 19th century specimen books has reminded me that we also need a language of tolerances, right? A language directed not just at capabilities, but also at constraints, right? The history of typography rendered within 19th century specimen books is clearly a history of shapes constrained by the techniques used to produce them. Most obvious case, right? Ligatures, right? Speak to the tolerances of cast metal. Indeed, cast metal just tolerates certain faces better than others, which has had powerful implications historically for the representation of non-Latin scripts. Letterpress tolerates some linguistic traditions better than others. Think, Arabic, think Urdu. The specimen books that I've been reading are silent on this politics. Instead, they tend to surface the constraints of cast metal when they acknowledge its technological alternatives. George Bruce's Sons, for instance, has some script faces that they say can compete with copperplate engraving. And I'll flash it at you because it's just like those subword tokens by OpenAI when you cast a single sort that's ing or ly. Obviously, the large wooden poster type that is also sold by these type foundries speaks to other material constraints. And I'm always so moved, touched, right, by the way these specimen books seem to yearn for curvilinear forms, right, compositions that really sort of struggle against letterpress and speak to the potentiality of other, typographical technologies like, lithography and the like. So different typographical methods, different affordances, different tolerances. And I think you and I could sit here and we could sort of tick through technology by technology and sort of play out what the potentials and what the limitations are. In their own way, I think that the typographical hallucinations speak to lingering constraint amid ongoing fanfare, right? It could be that the constraint is architectural inside the model. It could be related to the way the training data and the prompt are tokenized. That seems to have been what OpenAI thought at the beginning. Or it could be that all of the images on the internet, right, typography in the wild, really can't teach typography. I think we are going to find out, right? So again, stay tuned. I think this question is going to be answered. Okay, fine. Last thing. I don't know if you're going to go with me on this one, that the pleasure of type specimens and the pleasure of generative AI feel related. But I want to end with a comparison of that ilk. You may have noticed within the groundswell of popular discourse around generative AI, statements like this one that have proliferated, right? A robot wrote this entire article. So this is from the Guardian newspaper in 2020, but certainly, this shtick is everywhere since ChatGPT in 2023, widely used, over and over again. A passing phenomenon, no doubt, and good for a few yucks. But I think we could usefully compare these statements to that perennial and oh so pleasing catchphrase, this page intentionally left blank. I mean, think. Both statements are demonstrative, right? Demonstrative pronoun this. Both are also statements of authorial self-abnegation, wherein a human subject, right, maybe an editor in the first instance, maybe a copywriter in the second, manages to eke out, right, a minor metapragmatic role, at least for now, right? Non-authors, these humans still perform essential labor behind the scenes. They label, right, this article, this page, and they do so within one or another hugely elaborate text-generating arenas descended without question from the one that I've been generalizing as the printing trades. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. The floor is open. First comments. Zach.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And, I've often wondered why typography is so bad in these image generators, because it seemed like it should be very good when you first think about it. It should be better than like, can you show me a picture of a waterfall with a man? And, it has to generate image there, but you think it should be good because it can just do OCR on this stuff and it knows what letter it is. So there's a couple of things I wanted to ask about that. One is, one of the things that you read in like cognitive science around typography, you can read two opposing things and I've never sorted out. One is that like some people seem to think that certain typefaces are easier to read than others. And then other people very much, and all typefaces in circulation are basically equivalently easy to read for people, and that those are competing theories. And so one thing I wonder about is like, faced with all the typography out there, is there something that like the image generator is telling us about the difficulty of inflating all instances of the letter M in like the 100 different typefaces as an M that I would have thought we would have learned already from OCR, but something else seems to be going on here. And then the second question I had is, why in the 4 images of the alphabet books, where you're explicitly told to do an alphabet book, now there's numbers in alphabet books often, so I'm assuming, but the only number that appears in all of them, like in all of them with a number, the only number is the number 7. So like, what is it about the number 7 that makes it seem most appropriate for an alphabet book?
Yeah.
It's next to Z sometimes, and it's like almost a Z, but not almost next to Z. that seemed like an interesting instance for me to think about, like, what's going on more generally, like, what is it doing? When it's pulling out letters, like,
Right.
why, if you tell it write NYU on a shirt, it seems to me that's easier than creating the person, but it's harder than creating.
Yeah, or we are better at detecting the errors, you know, would be with people, except maybe with hand, this is
With
the whole thing
hands.
about hands, yeah. Two great questions. I did originally think, well, maybe there is some method here that maybe the some letters are harder than other letters, the way some typefaces are harder than others. And so I did some compare, there's no rhyme or reason. I think it's more likely that the typography in the wild is messing things up. In other words, that because they're obviously trained on books, images of books, but they're trained more on images of the world, right? And you think about driving a car, about the flashes of sideways signage, and it's actually the people who train these systems actually probably want typography in the wild, because these systems are they're driving self-driving cars, right? And you want a self-driving car to be able to catch the teeniest bit of a stop sign and realize that it's a stop sign, right? So I think that's kind of what's under there.
So if you could tell it, like, restrict this to a subset of images, which are like Google Books, it might get
Yes.
the text.
I think that's true. I think that's true. And I mentioned this to somebody, actually, Tyler Shoemaker, who's a friend of mine who had that great visualization of tokenization. And he said, actually, the people who are training these self-driving car systems have used Google Books. It was a really good way to train, you stay in your lane if something has a gutter, right? And a margin. So who knows?
Wow.
Who knows what's happening? Then that's, I suppose, I didn't even say this, and I should have said it, but we just don't know, and not because the technology is so hard, it's because it's just trade secrecy all the way down. We just don't know. The number 7, that's a good call. I have stared long and hard at those alphabet books, and part of me thinks that there's yet another thing that I didn't know how to talk about going on. And that is that inside the architecture of these systems, there's one architecture called the convolutional neural network. And I think that some of the things we see in those alphabet books are artifacts of that particular architecture. I don't know why I think that, but just from studying that a few years ago, some like the sort of spill of a piece of a letter just looks familiar to me. From other weird things.
Yeah, I mean, what's striking is when it gets a letter wrong, you can see that it's struggling, right? The real letters are clear and have defined outlines, and the funny letters are kind of messy, right? They're fuzzy, they're not shaped right. So I mean, you feel its pain while it's trying to do that. I mean, I have a question about the tokens, which I guess I'm not fully understanding. I mean, you drew the analogy between the tokens and, let's say, ligatures in the type books, or the ing, which gets put together as a unit. In your sample of the 1960s poster, right, what it's getting wrong is it spells brighter, BRI kind of Y. And again, it's fuzzy, HTER. So what am I not understanding about a token that would know that letter combination of IYHT doesn't work in English, right? And that there is a letter combination that does work in English that kind of looks like that. So.
Well, I don't know if I'm really going to be able to describe this clearly, but so textual data just gets chopped up in all kinds of ways. And I had that one slide that shows some of how that happens. And what the OpenAI people were trying to say about mistakes like that poster is that usually it's words and subword tokens. I mean, there are examples where it is individual letters, but it's usually not individual characters. Mm-hmm. They were expecting that if text was tokenized as individual letters, that the system would be better at individual letters. I mean, I think that's what's going on there. So I don't think it had anything to do with how though those particular semi-letters are tokenized someplace in the
mhm.
data.
Right, thanks. Michael.
And thank you for the wonderful talk. And the question I want to ask is out of total ignorance in a way. But I was trying to think about these same issues. And I was thinking about the fact that, and I'm thinking about your term typography or just about anything in the wild, right? And one of the things I was wondering about was, for example, one of the ways that Google Translate got better several years ago now is because it started paying attention in the same way as you were talking about to tokens, i.e., it wasn't just trying to translate the word, it was trying to translate the word in context to the words surrounding it, etc. And that's one of the ways also that about a few years ago, Google Cloud Vision got better at OCR because it was paying attention to the letters around it. So this sort of contextual thing. So I'm trying to wrap my brain around that but the thing I really was thinking about and I wanted to ask you about was if the way that DALL-E 3 works is it's looking at something like an image with the help of a human annotator, who is limited, right? The annotations are limited, human beings are limited, they're flawed. Is one of the problems simply that there's so much more stuff out in the wild and so little stuff that's annotated? So that so if we start, like if we all annotate something, right? If we're the annotators and we constitute, 1/1,000,000th of 1% of what's in the wild, and then we let the thing go wild, it's gonna I sort of believe that's what produces the letter book Hallucinations. It's that it's like Matt Kirschenbaum's Taxopolis, right? If you send it out in the wild without enough annotators, it's going to sort of keep learning through those approximations like Jerry's talking about, where it's sort of a G, but it turns into a Y, but it's am I even that's the way my brain was sort of imagining the problem you were trying to talk about. Does any of that work? Or is any of that in sync with how you've been trying to hallucinate these problems?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think that is what OpenAI is concerned about when with DALL-E 3, they said, I know, we will take these feebly annotated images, these labeled images, with ridiculous one-word labels, that some web developer threw on something. And we will use AI to augment, right? So in that paper that publishes the poster, they start with one junky word to annotate an image and they end up with a paragraph, right, of rich language. And so they were able to do this for huge data sets. So I don't think that is quite the problem still. I think rather what's going on, and I don't understand image tokenization quite well enough to explain it, but that when these labeled images are tokenized, what's happening is you have in hundreds of dimensions or variables, image text correlation bits, little bits of image text correlation that are sort of plotted into these vectors, and it's those kind of statistical probabilities that are being analyzed to then give back results.
It's fascinating.
It is kind of truly, scary and fascinating.
So Matt Kirschenbaum and then from the floor. So Matt, hello.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, Lisa. That was fabulous. I may just play that on a loop for the next 24 to however knows how many hours. This question really kind of follows from the last two, which one of the most interesting things here, and that I'm having trouble getting my head around a little bit, is what the unit of analysis is. In other words, what is the token finally? So in the case of language models, the process is fairly straightforward, as you demonstrated. But like for the example of, I think it was the word writer, where it misspells it with the Y instead of a G. It's not getting the token wrong at the character level. It's really, I mean, what the image, the text that we're reading is still an image, right? And that it's coming not from a large language model like ChatGPT, it's coming from an image model. And so there's a sense in which the failure is that it's not producing a pattern of pixels that happens to look like a G as opposed to the pattern of pixels that looks like a Y instead. I'm not sure where to go with that. I mean, I think, again, it underscores for me the importance of the question of what is the unit of analysis? What is the token? And I would connect that back to the type specimen books. Someone who knows much more about typography than me, I would be interested to hear them speak about the ways in which different families, genealogies, right, the terms that we use are suggestive of type, sort of borrow individual aspects of the letter forms, right? Oh, you know, that serif descends to us from this prior family of type, or that descender, that ascender, the thickness of the various strokes, right? All of that, it seems to me, as part that it seems to me that letter forms can be tokenized at that level, as well as at the level of actual characters or sorts, which again just brings us back to that question of what is the basic unit here? What is the token finally? And whether that ambiguity around the token is maybe something that your paper is actually getting at, that it's kind of illuminating or underscoring for us.
Yeah, that's super helpful, because I think what I'm trying to talk about is not the token as a unit of analysis so much as it's the twinning, the correlation of tokens, image and text. And I kind of skipped this sentence because you know, I was trying not to read, but you know, as you say, the letters generated by DALL-E 3 are images of letters. They're not text, right? They're shapes in text appropriate contexts. Some of them just shaped a lot more like letters than others.
Right.
And so that again is that image text, you know, the two sides of the page that we see at every turn here. And in order to function as they function, these generative systems have that the twinned token, that correlation, right, is I think the unit that we need to be concerned with. But of course we can't see inside the layers, so we don't, you know, I don't certainly understand what's going on.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks. Yeah.
Like ChatGPT, you get hallucinations. What we mean by that in that context is like made up facts or the bad citation. You don't get made up letter forms,
Right.
and you don't get misspelling, or
Right.
at least I haven't seen a lot of misspelling. So
Punctuation.
it's getting at the fact that ChatGPT, like the AI, is drawing letters. Just like if I tried to write in Chinese characters, I would make errors that someone who's fluent in Chinese would think are really weird. They sort of look like character, but they're not, because it's drawing these letters. And I guess one question is like, why not do that? Why not have it type the letters the way that ChatGPT does? But
this is sort of a related question, or touches on related issues. I wanted to thank you for exploding my brain a little bit and allowing me to think about things differently in a way that I really needed to. I'm thinking a little bit more conceptually, and I'm interrogating what I suspect are my own anxieties of authorship here. So it seemed to me that you sketched a kind of analogical system between two sets of technologies that revolved around a relationship, as I understand it, between a compositor, if you use a very neutral term, exposure, which I think was the thing that you didn't really talk about, the number of iterations or repetitions of exposure of the compositor to those forms, and the tokens. And the tokens for me are kind of allowing me to think differently. And so I really wanted to be persuaded that both generative AI and typographical specimen books could be analogues for each other, but I found myself resisting because I'm not sure I'm persuaded that the typographical example is without an author in the same sense. And it did occur to me that within that model that I thought you were maybe setting up, there was a fourth term, the trainer, whether that is the person that's happening. It's the form of agency that arranges the set of technologies in order to produce. I don't know if that's a useful way of thinking about it, but you can see how I think you could argue in the typographical specimens that there is an author because there is somebody who's arranging based on their exposure and things they're exposed to a set of text. So in that sense, it's related to but not identical to AI. And so I want to know more about that. And then the other thing that occurred to me while you were talking is, how is this any different fundamentally to paleography or systems of writing, which participate in exactly the same triangulation of a compositor, exposure, the number of forms that you're exposed to, and the reproducibility. You know, so handwriting is the first reproductive technology of meaning, and it seems to me as handwriters, there might be something in the way we learn or think about tokens, both because they're non-typographical, they're image-based, but also, and of course the bigger question is that all of this can only work in a shared ecology of cultural recognition, can't it? You know, where the forms are readable or recognizable. And I wondered if there's a way of using handwriting to think about that particular problem. But so I wanted you to convince me that typographical specimen books don't have authors.
Okay,
And who is the trainer?
the trainer.
And why doesn't handwriting?
The handwriting question is so interesting, and of course, I'm way out of my depth if I start talking about paleography or anything like that. Though let me just sort of put that question over here and mention that one of the earliest breakthroughs in this flavor of deep learning was on handwriting recognition. The kind of back propagation breakthrough, I guess in the 80s, had to do with like zip codes. So there's a way to work that in at some point, if I think about it. But the trainer and the printing trades as agents, I think one of the, because I'm thinking about the printing trades as this agential force in a way, a kind of generative complex of images and texts. Of course, it includes lots of human agents, including the people we would call authors, right, who take their manuscripts to the print shop, or their engravings or whatever. But you know, I guess I want to think, first of all, that typography is very, despite design patents, it's impossible to copyright. You know, that is the sort of the third rail, if you like, of intellectual property. And so there's a way in which typefaces are unauthored, but then I think the books too, because they speak so much from and to a kind of guild solidarity, are artifacts of a collective production, right? And sure, they're proprietary. It's George Bruce's, or it's McKellar Smith's, or it's, you know, Union Type. I mean, they're all, somebody would claim ownership of them. Somebody would claim to have authored them. But I think they're really, and then they include this hallucinogenic sort of array of textual fragments. I want to call them unauthored. The other person that I've seen sort of trying to work out a similar analogy is Ryan Cordell, who has this viral text project, and he's really thinking about 19th century newspapers in similar terms. As that, this is really riffing on Meredith McGill in so many ways, on the culture of reprinting, endemic to printing in the 19th century, particularly in the US. That once you get to that space of absolute circulation, where copyright, is immaterial. I think because of scale, it becomes possible to think think of it as an analogy. I mean, really is, I think the scale of the training data sets that has made all the difference. That's why GPT-2 was such a, revelation. And all the printed matter in the 19th century, that's a lot. You don't have to be 100% convinced. I hope it's suggestive.
It's
I mean,
not suggestive, but yeah, I think there is, one of the things that struck me is in one of the examples that you used, there would be patterns. Obviously, we could analyze it. There would be patterns of cultural recognition. Like there was a particular font used to mark a gravestone, and the choice of text, the meaningful text, was to do with a gravestone. There's a set of associations there and a choice that means that that set of meanings is inserted in the book and not something totally random. So in that sense, even though it's endlessly reproducible, and I accept your argument that they might then become tokens on their own, Garamond only ever appears with these words associated with it. There is something higher than an order of position, I think, going on even in those books that.
Yeah, no, terrific. I think if you haven't read it, I think you'd really like the Kate Bordeaux book.
Okay.
Because, one of her points, I mean, first she's just sort of provoked by the absolute profusion of faces, but then she said, just because we can't say what a serif of exactly this shape means, doesn't mean it doesn't mean something. We just can't say it. That's the ultimate provocation. And so I really did have this kind of naive, quixotic hope that AI could see typographic shape. And there have been attempts. I mean, I think there was a design firm that they kind of mapped, I don't know how many, 50,000 faces or something like that. And the thing is that, so you click on it and, it's this map, and you can't learn anything from this map except that typefaces are related, which we knew already.
Yeah, but I mean, with the type specimen books, get back. I mean, typefaces do have affects, right? When I was working at the press, social sciences books would often have chunky sans serif display type, and I would never allow that typeface in an early modern literature book. It had to be a serif, it had to be elegant. The question of authorship in this, there are different ways of displaying samples of type. In an odd way, if you're always citing the same texts of Cicero, even though that's the text of Cicero, that's authorless, right? Because it's kind of content neutral, and you have all of the typefaces using the same text. Or if you have, Greeking, which is just Latin words as gobbledygook, that's all neutral. But the example that we ended on when you were scrolling through, which the typeface was called condensed runic. And the words that were used for condensed runic were nimbiferous and summer dreaming, titty sweets lip drops, coquette's heart wreckers. I mean, they were all kind of delicate, feminine, a little pretentious, right? I don't know what nimbiferous means, but you wouldn't have had the page before, which was really, hard-hitting news headline stuff. You never would have seen nimbiferous in that typeface, right? So there is some kind of
I don't
choice.
know,
Yeah.
Jerry. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well,
so people have looked at these books a lot, give Thomas McKellar, and that was McKellar, Smith and Jordan, a lot of credit for sort of introducing humor.
Yeah.
And I brought a McKellar. I should have brought this before, but I do have a McKellar.
Oh, great.
So we
Yeah.
look at it out.
Quiet meal, washing day dinner.
It's very funny.
Yeah. It's in a comic verse. And,
This argument.
well, yeah, I think that people give him credit for introducing the humor that gets then picked up. And yet, I think if you look at earlier books,
Yeah.
it's not like I don't I mean, I find them
Oh,
funny.
irony.
Maybe not in that particular arch way.
I'm going to read a question from the chat. This question comes from Danny Snelson. Danny writes, "This was so wonderful. Thank you. I had a question about multimodality in these models. I've been thinking a lot about what Hannes Fayor has called operative ekphrasis, that large language models mysteriously produce better text when they're also trained on images than when they're trained on massive amounts of text. I'm wondering how the reverse applies to image graphics of text. In other words, if it might be possible to test text to image ratios in the typographic accuracy of image generation or sound, moving image, 3D objects, etc. Or more generally, how are you thinking about multimodal training in these specimens?"
Oh, okay, this is over my head, but thank you for the question. Yeah, I looked at a few of these articles that are about multimodality, and really all that means in data science is that you have text, image, and you know, image data, two kinds of data. Could be, you know, other two kinds of data, but that's multimodal. And so, yeah, data scientists have been seeing the advantage of multimodality in some really interesting ways. But I cannot say anything more than that. So the question has just educated me in that direction. I gotta figure that out.
Okay, was there another?
No.
Yeah. Whitney.
This is awesome. I just on this question of type specimens, I have a lot in my head, but one of the things is I think we're getting caught up sometimes a little bit too much in like text. When one of the things you showed us is that they have lots of images. Like in our Zach and I's class last year, we had a student, Ariana, who did a really fabulous project looking at some of our wonderful type specimens, where she looked at the icon frequently used in the runaway slave ads. And she pointed out how some kind of show agency, some don't, and just did like a really wonderful close reading of this icon, which suggests to me, I mean, it suggests a lot, but one of the things is that like the type specimen books, they're economic. So like the question of authorship in some ways, it's collaborative, it's collective, it's like this economic agency of a printer who wants to make money is going to offer the widest array of possible icons, possible typefaces, unless they're specializing in something. So there's something there where that's kind of suggestive to me, and that it's drawing in text and image in ways that are working together the same way that AI is with this question of multimodality, but also that the it's an odd or like a kind of imperfect mirror of society. Like, we don't know what the printers thought about runaway slave ads, but they made money on them, so they're gonna print them, right? And they're gonna have icons that provide to printers, like the type founder is gonna make the icon to provide it to printers, right? So, you know, just kind of in an interesting way, echoing some of the conversations in critical AI studies around like racial bias. So I don't know that I have a question here, except I'm kind of interested in, like, if we think about AI reading the sign, but you mentioned a stop sign, but it can read the icon of the stop sign, which is like an international symbol, right? And of course, I'm thinking also about your work on Moby Dick and emojis. Like, there's something about icons here that's really interesting and collapsing of text and image. And when we read these type specimens too much, as for the kind of fun, delightful poetry in them, we're like missing that it's turning the text into an image in the same way that AI needs to in order to, or it actually the opposite that it needs to do in order to extract the text. There's like this friction there that's interesting. I'm just echoing a lot of what you were saying, but I'm just kind of interested in picking that.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Yeah, no, you're entirely right. I got super interested in just what were called the newspaper cuts, for many of the reasons that you're suggesting, the little tiny things, because I recognize them from all the earlier newspapers. And the thing that they show up in these late century specimen books, and they're so clear, you know, they're not like in the newspapers because they've finally been electrotyped. And I don't, you know, we have that really good McCullough book now about printing with plates. And he says a little bit about what happened in job printing and rather newspapers, but not enough. And we don't really have a clear account of how to follow your, you know, kind of political economic thread, how electrotyping changed the availability, the ubiquity, the quality, you know, anything else of these images that were everywhere. At the same time, they were sort of falling out of newspapers, right? The little ship with the shipping news,
Yeah.
right? By the time of McKellar, Smith and Jordan is a kind of a, you know, a throwback. And yet it's there in this beautiful, pristine, electrotyped version.
Because the type specimens are being electrotyped, or because the specimen book, or because the specimen?
The specimen for job printers were finally being electrotyped, right? And so sometimes those images are sold as electrotypes. You know, these intricate, you know, trade images, you know, the pawn shop thing or the, you know.
Right, because as Peter would remind us, it's always the job printing where the most elaborate, interesting, ambitious stuff is. It's not in newspapers or books. You're always gonna show off your coolest stuff in job printing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
Use
think
your most decorations and your most gizmos and your most flower stuff.
yeah.
Artist, ironically. How does it work? Well, did this problem that you're outlining to us, Lisa, happen with other languages? It must have done, or, you know, how's this working in Farsi, Hindi, in
God, that's a great question. And I can only think that it's worse because there just isn't as much data yet.
Chinese, not
Just-
Chinese, right? I mean,
Whitney, I did bump into one, just a side note, one of these specimen books that was itself electrotyped. But, you know, side note. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, like the fruit books, clearly in the signage, clearly there's a lot of text on the internet that is not English, that has umlauts, for instance, or that's Cyrillic, which might explain the UQ thing. You know, so there are reasons to think that we are working with a very multilingual data
I was
set
wondering about that. Throwing it in. Yeah.
in the training data, but that tips, you know, tips Anglophone. So we'll see, you know, and I've been at data science talks where, you know, graduate students are bemoaning the fact that we're running out of data. And the data scientists sort of talk them down from the ledge and say, we're not running out of data. You know, all we have to do is digitize everything in Indonesian. And we'll have plenty of data forever. So, yeah.
It would be an interesting experiment to create, like, to train only on the 19th century digitized specimen book.
Yes, it
See
would.
if it could recognize, well, like Anglophone,
Mhm.
only Latin script.
Yeah. I wonder if there's enough of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was, somebody sent me a link to another project that somebody pulled down 50,000 typefaces from digital fonts, and then did some like averaging GIF animations of what was there. Again, you don't learn that much. And if you're just pulling down digital fonts from the internet, you're getting so much garbage that I'm not sure it would say anything. I mean, it's a compelling idea.
Well, thank you so much for really a talk that has generated much discussion, many questions, reminds us how befuddled I think we and AI remain. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.